July of 1615. A woman of 29 puts into words what she would do if the enemy came into the church. Saving her own life was no part of the request. She would ask that death not come in a single blow, so that the hours spent on her would not be hours spent offending the Blessed Sacrament, the consecrated host exposed on the altar. The request was for a slow death. Isabel Flores de Oliva, that was her name. The world came to know her as Saint Rose of Lima. These words are hers. I will beg the heretics not to take my life with a single blow, so that all the time they spend upon it may be time in which they are held back from carrying out the outrages that I fear, alas, they will afterwards commit against my sweet spouse. A friar of the Dominican order, Leonardo Hansen, preserved them in the first biography ever written of her, printed in Rome in 1664, a church in Lima in that same month of July. The fear settled over the city kept the Blessed Sacrament exposed on the altar, and the wax burns in broad daylight, which is not normal. It smells of wick. It smells of flowers trodden on the floor. The women, shoulder to shoulder, are on their knees on the cold brick, and their murmuring does not stop. A woman in a black veil and a white tunic is among them, and with her eyes she is measuring the distance from the door to the altar. Outside, far off, the port. Before we go on, just 3 seconds. One single word in the comments, time. Once you have done that, scroll down a little and watch the column that builds itself, the same word one beneath the other, coming from people who will never meet. And if you wish, add an intention, for someone waiting on a result that has not yet come, for someone whose work is done with their hands and whose money does not reach the end of the month, for someone who is laughed at for praying. If you are watching on your phone, notice how that church filled up. It came from no decree. One woman went to fetch another at her house, one by one. Down below, drag the comment bar to the left, and a button called Hype appears. One tap on that button carries this story into one more home. Further on, we will see the whole city kneeling before her body, and someone from the middle of the line leans down and tears off a piece. The woman who wore the black veil was no convent nun, no cloistered nun, no abbess, and between her and the street there was no wall. She lived with her parents and drew the family's keep from 2 things she made with her hands: embroidery, delivered to the households of the city, and flowers, grown in the yard and carried to the market. And from there, she went out to church and to care for the sick. When she asks to die slowly, what she is doing is arithmetic. Her life was not what was being offered. Whoever offers their life dies quickly, and quickly was exactly what she did not want. She was offering time. And she did that arithmetic inside out, from the side of whoever might come through the door with a weapon in hand, and not from her own side. She never did make that request. No one came into that church. The words stayed where they were. They were said aloud to those standing near her, set down in writing much later, and they never came to be used. That arithmetic is only understood 9 years earlier, in a yard in Lima, where a girl of 20 was putting up, with her brother's help, a hut of mud because her father had forbidden her to enter a convent. They called Lima the City of Kings, and when she was born the city had been founded 51 years. It was the capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru, the Spanish government in charge of half of South America, and the largest city on the continent. It was the silver of Potosi that paid for all of it, a mountain in Upper Peru on which the Spanish monarchy leaned from the other side of the ocean. It was the center of a trading network that put Peru in contact with Europe on one side and Asia on the other, by way of a galleon that crossed the Pacific to the Philippines and came back. About half the inhabitants of that city, around the year 1600, were people of African origin, enslaved and free. The rest were largely indigenous, and above them all sat a thin layer of Spaniards. The Lima she knew was a black and indigenous city with a white elite on top. Isabel Flores de Oliva was born on the 20th of April, 1586, and was baptized in the parish of San Sebastian. Her father, Gaspar Flores, was an arquebus soldier, the long firearm of that army, and had come from Cáceres in Spain. Her mother, Maria de Oliva, was from Huánuco, up in the mountains, and lived by spinning and sewing, The house was full of brothers and sisters. The needle with which she would come to support that house is no saint's emblem. It is her mother's trade, handed from hand to hand inside a kitchen. A servant of the house said she had seen the face of the 3-month-old girl turn into a rose, and her mother began calling her by that name. She hated that nickname. She was the only person in the city who bore it, and she was laughed at for it. She only accepted it at 25, when a priest said to her in the church of Santo Domingo, "Well then, daughter, is your soul not like a rose in which Jesus Christ takes his delight?" Among the patronages the church assigns to her, and this one almost never appears on the holy cards, is that of people ridiculed for their devotion. Around the age of 12, the family moved to Cueves, a village in the valley of the Chillon River, where her father went to work in a mine. It was there, and not in Lima, that Archbishop Toribio de Mogrovejo confirmed her and gave her the name Rose. That archbishop would be canonized more than a century later. A saint confirmed another saint, and the record of it is kept in her cause. The village is called Santa Rosa de Lima today because of that afternoon. She wanted to be a cloistered nun. Her father forbade it. In 1606, at 20 years old, she took the habit of the Third Order of Saint Dominic, the order of Dominican lay people, men and women, who make vows and go on living in the world, at home, with their own family. In the same act, she made a vow of perpetual virginity. It was the exact imitation of Catherine of Siena, who had done the same 300 years earlier in Italy. She never had a cell, never had a grill, never had a wall. Her house inside the house was a hut of adobe, mud dried in the sun, raised by her and by her brother Hernando in a corner of the yard. It was from there that she went out to church and to tend the sick, and it was there that she came back. By day, the garden. She grew flowers in the yard and carried them to the market to sell. By night, the needle. She embroidered and made lace for families of the city, fine work, commissioned and paid for. It is because of that trade, and not because of the nickname her mother gave her, that she is the patron of florists, gardeners and embroiderers. The sick came inside the house. She took in from the street people with fever and people with hunger, above all indigenous and black people, and set up in that yard a kind of infirmary. The one who opened her eyes to the condition of the indigenous people was Mariana, the family's indigenous servant, who years later testified in her cause. There is today an academic study devoted solely to that woman's testimony. A morning in that yard, in some year between 1606 and 1617, the freshly wetted adobe wall smells of earth. The flower beds are cut close because the flowers have already gone into the market basket. By the door there is another basket, with lace still unfinished. And from inside, the house comes a cough, and then another, and then the silence of people lying on mats on the floor. She slept at most 2 hours a night in order to have more hours of prayer. She fasted 3 times a week from girlhood and never ate meat again. She wore at her waist an iron chain shut with a padlock under her clothes. When she was praised for her beauty, she cut off her hair and rubbed pepper on her face. On her head she wore an object that almost every painting gets wrong. It was not a crown of thorns. It was a silver headband, a strip worn across the head with 3 rows of 33 metal points. 33 the years of Christ, 99 points in all. And the one who denies the crown of thorns is no historian. It is the Archdiocese of Lima itself, which published the correction. She wore the headband always and took it off only when illness forced her to rest. It went under the veil. No one saw it. She received communion every day, an extremely rare practice at that time. The ground of Lima and of Callao shook on the 19th of October, 1609. Around 500 houses came down, and almost no building was left undamaged. She was 23 years old, and she was in the city. And this was the woman who on a July morning in 1615 shortened her skirts, took off her shoes, and asked to die slowly. The 12 years truce, signed between Spain and Holland 6 years earlier to last 12, held in Europe and did not hold in the Pacific. On the other side of the world, the ships of the 2 crowns went on hunting one another as though no war had ever stopped. At the beginning of 1615, 6 Dutch ships crossed the Strait of Magellan at the southern tip of America and came up the coast attacking ports of Brazil, of Argentina, and of Chile. The man who commanded them was called Joris van Spilbergen, and he was a privateer, not a pirate. A captain holding a letter of marque, authorized in writing by his own government to attack the enemy's ships. The viceroy of that time, the Marquis of Montesclaros, sent a squadron out to meet him. On the 17th and 18th of July at Cerro Azul, near Cañete, south of Lima, the viceroy's squadron was defeated at sea. After that defeat, between the city and that Dutch squadron, there was nothing left. 3 days later, the ships were in front of the port. The Dutch ships dropped anchor off Callao, the port of Lima, on the 21st of July, 1615. The city lies a few leagues from the sea, joined to the port by a straight road that landed men would cover in a single morning. No one in Lima had any doubt about what those motionless masts meant. The Archbishop ordered the Blessed Sacrament exposed in the churches of the city. That is why the wax burned by day. The consecrated host was out of the tabernacle, in plain sight on altars open from morning to night, and before each one of them there was always someone kneeling. A rumor was running through the city, and it had a precise address. They said the Dutch, who were Calvinists, would break into the convent of Santo Domingo to profane the Eucharist and carry off the treasure. The building the rumor pointed to was the very one where 9 years earlier she had received the habit of a Dominican laywoman from the hands of the friars. Notice what that rumor does to the fear of a woman of 29. The center of it is not her death, but what those men would do after killing. Around 3,000 men went down to the beach on the viceroy's orders. Friars of several orders formed armed companies and went to guard the doors of the convents of nuns. The people of Callao abandoned their houses in the port and came into Lima with whatever they could carry in their arms. While the 3,000 men were on the beach, she went to the church of Our Lady of the Rosary, and she did not go alone. That church was her everyday church, the one at the end of the walk she made from the hut in the yard. She went to fetch the women of Lima and gathered them there to pray. To her mother, who wanted her indoors, she said she was going to overcome all those soldiers with the rosary she had in her hands. Then she shortened her skirts so that the cloth would not catch at her legs, and took off the chapines, the shoes with high clay soles that women wore so as not to drag their skirts through the filth of the street. She took them off for a practical reason. Barefoot, she could run. The Church of the Rosary, on an afternoon of that July. The candles burn in daylight and the smell of wick hangs still in the air, with no wind to carry it off. 30 or 40 women pray in low voices, and the murmur rises and falls as though it were a single breath. On the brick floor, 2 high clay-soled shoes are set side by side out of place. The feet that left them there are cold against the brick, and they are measuring the distance still to go to the altar. It was in that church that she said what she would do if they came through the door. The words are these: "I shall fight and die for the divine sacrament. Thus I shall climb the sooner upon the altar, and there set out my body as a shield, so that it may receive the blows and the wounds that the heretics hurl at the body of my Lord Jesus Christ, without my drawing aside a single point, until, my body run through in many places by the pikes and halberds of the impious enemies of the faith, I fall dead upon the altar." Pikes and halberds were the long spears of the infantry of that time, made to reach a body before that body could reach you. She knew the names of the weapons. The second thing she said there is the thing that gives this story its name. "I will beg the heretics not to take my life with a single blow, so that all the time they spend upon it may be time in which they are held back from carrying out the outrages they will afterwards commit against my sweet spouse." She was not calculating her own death. She was calculating their clock. Every minute spent killing her slowly was a minute that would not be left over for offending the host exposed on the altar. That is why she asked to die slowly. The one who collected these 2 sayings was a Dominican friar, Leonardo Hansen. In the book he wrote about her under the title Vita Mirabilis, Admirable Life, printed in Rome in 1664. He wrote almost 50 years after that July, gathering what was told by the people who had been near her in those days. Spielbergen did not land. He did not attack Lima. He did not attack Callao. And days later he weighed anchor and headed north. Paita, then Acapulco, then the Moluccas Islands, on the other side of the Pacific. He never came back to that coast. The military explanation is in the documents, and there is nothing beautiful about it. At Cerro Azul he had lost a ship, had been left with 5 badly damaged ones, and with about a quarter of his men out of action. When he ordered the boats lowered off Callao, the cannon guarding the port opened fire on them. He had a crippled squadron, a landing under artillery and little to gain by it. The story that has been going round for centuries, that the leader of the privateers fell ill and died right there on board in front of the city, is false. Joris van Spielbergen died 5 years later, in 1620 at Bergen op Zoom in Holland, half a world away from that sea. There is no documented miracle in that July. She drove no one out. The whole sentence, the one the Catholic news agency that tells the story still uses today, is this: the squadron went away without attacking, and Lima attributed its deliverance to her prayers. From then on, the painters began to depict her with an anchor in her hand, and sometimes with the whole city of Lima hanging from that anchor. That is what could be verified of that July, and it is there in the paint. A woman who never set foot on a ship was left holding an anchor in her arms forever. No one climbed onto the altar, and no one had to decide how long it would take to kill a woman of 29 kneeling in the way. The sentence went unused, and it is because it went unused that it survived, written in a book, instead of being lost in the noise of a day of battle. Several of her writings survive in her own hand, and the one who states it is the Archdiocese of Lima. It is not true that she was illiterate. The same official text undoes another repeated image. She did not play the harp. She plucked a few strings of a guitar to sing to God, and nothing more. Around 1923, a Dominican friar named Luis Alonso Getino came upon 2 medios pliegos, 2 half-sheets of paper, which he described as Kabbalistic in appearance. They were hers. It was a ladder drawn out step by step, to which she gave the name Mystical Ladder of the Love of God. Along the way there are paper hearts cut out and glued on by her, crosses, and comments written in small handwriting, the hand of someone who has little paper. Those papers are not a diary. She wrote them out of obedience at her confessor's request, within a general confession, which was an examination of her spiritual state conducted by examiners. A laywoman, with no convent and no rule to cover her, with interior experiences to explain in a city where the Tribunal of the Holy Office had been operating since 1570, had to prove in writing what was happening to her inside. That tribunal never tried her, never arrested her, and never investigated her. The ones who were, after her death, were part of the circle of devout women that had gathered around her. Among them Luisa Melgarejo, a close friend and one of the witnesses in her cause, taken to the prisons of the Holy Office on the charge of feigning sanctity. On the 4th of October, 1616, Rose composed a set of clothes for the child Jesus, who was born naked and shivering with cold. The little shirt shall be of 50 litanies and 9,000 rosaries of thanksgiving to God, and 5 days of fasting. The swaddling bands shall be of 9 stations to the most holy sacrament, and 9 parts of the rosary, and 9 days of fasting, in reverence of the 9 months he spent in the most holy womb of his most pure mother. The embroiderer made the only layette she knew how to make without cloth. And notice what she put into the swaddling bands: 9 stations to the Blessed Sacrament, the same exposed host before which, more than a year earlier, she had said what she would do if they came through the door. This time there was no ship in front of the port. That was exactly how she counted time, in units of prayer. 3 letters in her hand also survive, and only 3. In one of them she is working for the founding of a monastery dedicated to Catherine of Siena, which she had announced in 1613. The monastery was founded in Lima in 1624, 7 years after her death. The Archdiocese of Lima grants her that single prophecy, and underneath it there was a written campaign, made by hand, addressed to those who could decide. Her last month she spent ill in the house of Gonzalo de la Maza, accountant of the viceregal government, and of his wife, Maria de Uzategui. The two had become her protectors. The illness was long, and Peruvian medicine today identifies it as tuberculosis. From 1614 onward, every 24th of August, she was seen cheerful, repeating the same sentence, that on a feast of Saint Bartholomew, she would be forever near her Redeemer. She was devoted to the apostle, as her mother was, and she fasted on the eve of his feast. She died in the first hours of the 24th of August, 1617, at 31 years of age. On that day, the church was celebrating Saint Bartholomew the Apostle. In front of the house, a crowd gathered wanting to see her. The body was taken to the oratory of the novitiate of Santo Domingo. There the Archbishop of Lima and the authorities of the city knelt before her and kissed her hand. One stretch of the procession was carried by the canons of the cathedral, as an archbishop is carried. Another was carried by the oidores, the judges of the royal audiencia, as a viceroy is carried. And the viceroy was there in person, the Prince of Esquilache. The streets of Lima in those days, the coffin rides high on the shoulders of those carrying it and moves slowly because the street will not open. The viceroy's guard pushes people to the sides and does not get far. Above the murmuring, a small dry sound is heard over and over. It is cloth tearing. Hands that nobody knows carry home pieces of the white habit, and in the middle of the line, someone bends down to her feet. She had to be dressed again, and more than once, and the sources disagree on how many times. Someone tore off one of her toes. The burial had to be postponed because the line in front of the body would not end. The news went up into the mountains. In Potosi, the silver mountain that paid for the empire on the other side of the ocean, the church bells pealed and lamps were lit in the houses and in the main buildings. Lights were lit in a city of miners for an embroiderer who had never been there. 8 days after the death, neighbors in Lima were already testifying before those who collected the depositions. The ordinary process heard 75 witnesses. The apostolic process, opened on the 4th of March, 1630, heard 171. That same dawn, Gonzalo de la Maza had her face portrayed. He called in an Italian painter working in Lima, Angelino Medoro. What came out of it is an oil on canvas, and it is today in the sanctuary on Tacna Avenue. It is the first witness to her physical appearance, and it was taken from a dead woman. All of her iconography descends from that canvas. Hundreds of biographies, thousands of images, Zurbaran, Murillo, and the holy cards that sit today in the wallets of people on 3 continents. All of them come from a face painted in front of a corpse in a house in Lima in August of 1617. That was the face of the woman who had asked to die slowly. In the convent of Santo Domingo, the same church where she prayed every day, there lived in those years a Dominican lay brother, a mulatto, 7 years older than she was, Martin de Porres. Many books write that the two were friends and that she helped him. That is not proven in his cause. What can honestly be said is what the Dominicans of Lima say. The city was small and walled, and it is very likely that they knew each other. 4 canonized saints lived in that city at the same time as she did. What is documented is enough. The skulls of Rose, of Martin de Porres, and of Juan Macias are kept today in the same building, the Basilica of the Convent of Santo Domingo in Lima. Hers is displayed to the public, topped with a crown of roses. With the Dominicans' authorization, in 2015, a Brazilian forensic anthropology team, with the researcher Cicero Moraes and Peruvian specialists, reconstructed her face in 3 dimensions from that skull. It is not a photograph. It is a scientific approximation, the face the skull suggests. It came out round with light brown eyes, different from the face in the paintings, which always gave her finer features. And the skull told one more thing. She suffered from deep headaches. The prior of the convent, Father Luis Ramirez, saw that face before almost everyone else. He described it like this: I saw a young woman, I saw an ordinary woman. On the 11th of August, 1670, Pope Clement X signed a bull under the name Sacrosancti Apostolatus Cura. The document declares her principal patron of all the provinces, kingdoms, islands and regions of all America, of the Philippines and of the Indies. And in the middle of the Latin it calls her Blessed Rose of Saint Mary, blessed and not saint. The canonization only came on the 12th of April, 1671, 8 months later. Rome handed her a continent before handing her the title. She had been beatified by Clement IX in Rome a few years before that, and the bull did something nobody had planned. It was the first act of a pope to treat the whole of America as a single unit of devotion. In the documents, her name is Rosa de Santa Maria. Rose of Lima is the name the world gave her afterwards, from the city. She died on a day that already had an owner. The 24th of August is the feast of Saint Bartholomew the Apostle, and an apostle does not give up his day. The rule of the Church is to celebrate each saint on the date of their death, and with her the rule did not fit. That is why, for centuries, her feast was on the nearest free day, the 30th of August. In 1969, a reform of the Roman calendar wanted each saint as close as possible to the day they died. In reorganizing the month of August, it freed up the eve, the 23rd. Her memorial moved there. But the reform left a door open, and it is that door that explains everything, unless the bishops' conference of each country judges another day better. In Peru, the tradition of the 30th of August was 3 centuries old. It stayed. Today, the 23rd of August, is the memorial on the calendar of the whole world, and it is the date of this video. The 30th of August is the feast in Peru and in much of America, with solemn mass, a procession through the streets of Lima, and a national holiday. In this year of 2026, the 30th falls on a Sunday. The Church gave her the 30th first, and centuries later gave her the 23rd. Peru kept the 30th. A whole country stops for a day because of an embroiderer of 31. The 30th has those who keep it by duty. The National Police of Peru render her honors on that date every year because she is their patron. If someone you know marks the calendar because of a saint, send this story to that person before you go on. One share, one name. That is how a story reaches a house it had not yet entered. In the courtyard of the house where she was born, on the first block of Tacna Avenue in Lima, there is a stone well about 20 meters deep. Every 30th of August, the line turns the corner. People write a petition on a piece of paper, fold it with both hands and let it drop. Then there is a whole second of silence, and only then does the paper reach the bottom. The devotion is more than a century old, and it does not come from her time. An elderly pope stopped on the 21st of January 2018 before 5 reliquaries in a side chapel of the Cathedral of Lima. He prayed for a church made great by the prayer, penance and charity of Saint Rose of Lima and Saint Martin de Porres. Notice where the penance appears, in the middle between prayer and charity, never on its own. The Church raised her to the altars for her prayer and her charity. The silver headband stayed under the veil, which is where it always was. What she offered in that July was left unspent. She measured the time that fits between the door of a church and the altar and decided to fill it with her own body. To ask to die slowly was, for her, a way of giving minutes to the Blessed Sacrament. You carry a similar reckoning, and it is worked out on the same clock. How much time your day gives to someone who can give you nothing back? To whom was your time today given, without your noticing? There is no need to answer out loud. It is enough to notice tomorrow, when the same hour comes round again. Saint Rose of Lima, pray for us.